Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Department of Homeland Security has now been in a shutdown for more than 2 months. DHS officials are warning Congress about growing backlog of contracts, canceled planning activities, and more impacts as the shutdown drags on. For the latest, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Terry.
What specifically is DHS saying about where it's falling behind due to the shutdown?
Yeah, it's interesting. You look across the different components. Let's start with the Coast Guard. Admiral Kevin Lunday, Commandant of the Coast Guard, testified before the House Appropriations Committee on Thursday of last week. He mentioned that the Coast Guard has over 5,000 unpaid utility bills right now. More than 100 providers have threatened to cut off electricity and water to Coast Guard stations. And then Lunday told lawmakers that the Coast Guard has a growing backlog of 18,000 merchant mariner credentials that are not being processed during the shutdown. And so the Coast Guard is really seeing some big effects on some of their normal operations, of course. You turn to Customs and Border Protection. Obviously, we know that the One Big Beautiful Bill provided a lot of funding for CBP and ICE, and so a lot of their employees have been paid throughout the shutdown. But CBP Commissioner Rodney Scott told the same House subcommittee that service contracts, are not allowed to kind of go forward to be renewed right now. And so he said that aircraft, patrol boats, patrol vehicles for CBP that need service, they're just sitting there parked. There's border surveillance equipment that requires maintenance that's offline until funding is renewed. He mentioned confidential human sources not being paid right now. So there's just a lot of those little effects across DHS that's starting to pile up here 2 months into this shutdown.
Those are pretty significant operational impacts. And of course, DHS also is responsible for cyber security. How are those kinds of impacts playing out?
Yeah, those are harder to measure, but there's certainly been some impacts. Nick Anderson, director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, testified last week as well. He mentioned how 40% of CISA's staff had been working through much of the shutdown until DHS recalled all of the furloughed workers last week. But CISA still can't legally carry out many non-accepted functions or non-exempt functions during the shutdown. And that really impacts an agency like CISA, where a lot of their work is kind of outreach-based, voluntary-based, and a lot of those things aren't accepted during a shutdown. Anderson was specifically asked how he feels about CISA's ability to deal with growing cyber threats to critical infrastructure, especially given the ongoing war in Iran.
Given our current situation, I'll be honest with you and tell you it is more limited than I would like. During the course of the shutdown, again, we've had approximately 40% of our staff working at CISA. A lot of those preparatory activities within the environment, a lot of the outreach that we would typically be able to do, that's simply not possible or legally allowed during the period of a shutdown. We're doing everything that we can.
That sounds pretty serious when you think about combat operations. We've also got upcoming international events here at home. What's happening with the World Cup, and how's that being affected by the DHS shutdown?
Yeah, that clock for the World Cup to start is starting to get really close. Chris Tomney, director of the Office of Homeland Security Situational Awareness up at DHS headquarters, was testifying on Wednesday of last week before the Senate Appropriations Committee. There was a lot of funding in the One Big Beautiful Bill for DHS to do some things on World Cup preparations, grants for state and local governments to deal with counter-drone issues, for instance. That was in that bill. And so they've been able to move forward. But Tommy mentioned that, there's just so much that goes into securing an event like the World Cup. And so the shutdown has certainly degraded some of that planning now that it's more than 2 months long.
It has hindered our coordination with state and locals. It has reduced our planning efforts. Without all that being said, though, let me assure this committee and the members of the public, we will have a safe, we will have a secure, it will be an enjoyable tournament, but it has had a negative impact on the planning.
We'll have to take his assertions at face value, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that those two statements kind of a little bit in conflict, but they're certainly they've been able to do less than they would have normally have liked to have done in preparation of this big event.
Justin, you mentioned that DHS brought back their furloughed employees last week, even without a permanent funding bill. What's been the impact of that?
Well, the big deal there was, and you look to comments from Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vogt last week, DHS was facing a situation where more and more employees were just going to look elsewhere for work if they were not going to be paid. And he said, actually last week in front of the Senate Budget Committee, that they had to make this move to pay DHS employees, or else, quote, Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen would have had a complete walkout on his hands, according to Russell Vogt. And so they needed to fund people's paychecks to kind of prevent that, in the words of Vogt. Now you do have people being paid, but the big question is, how long does that last? And that's what I think everyone is wondering right now. But you do have folks going back to work. They can't do non-accepted activities still, as CISA Director Nick Anderson mentioned. That is not allowed. And so they're just having to kind of be limited, even though they're back at the office.
Well, you asked the question, how long till DHS runs out of money to pay its employees?
Yeah, the One Big Beautiful Bill provided a lot of funding for DHS, but it is not a limitless amount of money. And if you read Vogt's comments closely during that meeting last week, he said there's a specific fund within that bill that they've been able to tap into. He didn't say what it was, but basically they've been able to use that to pay these furloughed DHS employees, these other DHS employees that weren't being paid up until the last couple of weeks. TSA officers, we haven't even mentioned them. They're being paid using some of that funding too, but we don't know how long it's going to last. Vogt indicated it's certainly not forever. And so he called again on Congress to come up with some sort of solution to this shutdown so that DHS can start going back to normal operations again.
Well, that's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for this update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com.